affection. Thanks, Andrew. So why don't you open your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6. I mentioned earlier that there's almost no text on parenting in the New Testament. There's only two. This is the most important one. But there's tons of lessons and training in the Old Testament on parenting.
Bill, is your mic on?
Pardon?
Your mic?
Hold on. Got it? It's on. That's fantastic. Is it working?
Kind of.
Sure.
Testing.
There it is.
Okay, good. Okay. So in the Old Testament, there's tons of examples about parenting. Like I read earlier the story of King David. But study the stories of the kings of Israel, and you get tremendous lessons on parenting. There's a great lesson in 1 Samuel, Eli and his sons. There's tons of stuff in Genesis about the patriarchs and their sons and daughters. And there's Proverbs, of course, which has lots of material on parenting. But this is our text in the New Testament. I want you to notice, as I told the men in the last session, that it's addressed to fathers. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Two things are discipline and instruction. We don't know for sure what it meant to not provoke your children to anger. Probably it meant don't be hypocritical. Live out what you're teaching your kids so that your children aren't provoked to reject your faith, become angry with you, disrespect you, because you're not living what you're teaching. So this morning, in this last talk, I want to talk about the discipline of the Lord, a job assigned first to fathers, and secondly to mothers, who are their crucial assistants. I want to say something very controversial. Are you ready? Fathers are the chief parents in the Bible. Now, how we apply that is another story. But throughout Scripture, virtually everything on parenting in Scripture is either about fathers and their children, or the text is directed directly to fathers about parenting. So the Bible, from beginning to end, presumes that the father is the chief parent in the home. But in our culture today, most dads are gone during the day, and moms are responsible, but do the hands-on of parenting. So mom is doing most of the actual parenting work. But if the dad and mom know that he's the chief parent, then when he gets home, they talk together, they agree together on a parenting strategy and a discipline strategy, so forth. But the dad and the mom both know that he's the one that's responsible before God for the household. And he takes that responsibility very seriously, and she does as well. There are quite a few parenting books out written by women that in and of themselves are not bad. The only problem is that most of the time those books don't say a thing about the father's role in parenting. In other words, there are books on parenting by women to women that are very incomplete. So usually my problem with those books is not that they teach bad doctrine, it's just they don't talk about what really matters. They assume that parenting is just the mom's task with the kids and dad is cut out of the process. So because of that, there's several of those books that, although they're good, we don't recommend at home, because we want books that will put a huge emphasis on the father's role in the parenting process. As we already noted, we learn to parent from God the Father. He's a lion and he's a lamb, and he gains influence over his children by dying. In the same way, effective training requires two ingredients from us as parents: discipline and affection. That's what this talk is about. Discipline and affection. God the Father is a lamb, he's affectionate, he's a lion, he's a disciplinarian. And effective parents do the same thing. They're strong with affection and strong with discipline. Children that receive affection without discipline, affection without discipline will alienate you from your children. It will cause them to despise you. All discipline and no affection will cause your children to resent you. I remember sharing the gospel with our family physician 25 years ago, who I really liked. And he said to me, I grew up in a really fundamentalistic sect. My father was a really strong disciplinarian. In fact, I think this doctor may have been gay, I don't know for sure. But my father was a really firm disciplinarian, and there was no affection. There was no joy. There was no kindness. There was no fun in our family. As a result, I said, I don't want anything to do with Christianity. The Christianity I grew up with, I don't want anything to do with it. Well, that's a good example of what happens when you have lots of discipline, can happen when you have lots of discipline and there's not corresponding affection involved. So I have 2 points this morning. The first is to talk about the discipline. I want to go back over our main point in just a second. Then we're going to talk about gospel discipline. God the Father's a lion. We're going to talk about what we have to do to be good disciplinarians. Then we're going to switch and talk about affection. Well, before we do that, I want to go back over this main point again. The most effective parents keep it really simple. They focus on knowing God, because God is, there we are. Because they believe the Bible is sufficient for parenting, they ignore most modern advice about child raising. Instead, they set biblical, ethical standards. Those are high standards, especially in the area of heart attitudes with our kids. They teach and discipline their children to those standards. They lavish their children with love and affection. Last, they rest in the grace provided by the gospel. So, gospel discipline. I want to say 3 things about discipline. First, parents who discipline effectively are clear about the problem. Indwelling sin. No fuzziness in their thinking here. They understand sin. Number 2, parents that are effective disciplinarians are clear about authority. They understand that God has put them in their children's lives as an authority figure, and they're willing to wield that authority, whether they feel adequate or not. They are willing to be an authority figure. A lot of parents want to be friends to their children when they're young. You can be friends when they're adults. In fact, you want to be friends with them when they're adults. When they're kids, you're not primarily a friend, you're an authority figure. When they get to their teens, later teens, you can become more of a friend with your kids, but you've got to be comfortable with being an authority figure. And I find that a lot of times this is a huge problem with parents. And thirdly, they aim their discipline at their child's hearts. So clear and indwelling sin, comfortable with being an authority figure, and thirdly, they're aiming their discipline at their child's heart attitudes. Not necessarily their behavior. They're after the heart. They want to change the heart. So our first point is, effective disciplinarians believe in indwelling sin. So what is your child's basic problem? Why do they lie, cheat, steal, hit, bicker, etc., etc.? Why do they bite when they're restless, selfish, or angry? Why do they talk back to their parents? If the problem is a disease, which is the reigning analysis or understanding of that problem in our culture, they have a disease, then they are sick, then they need medication. But if the problem is if the child's problem is their environment, a change of environment then is the answer. But if the child has a fallen nature, if they're infected with indwelling sin, then discipline and instruction are the solution to their problem. Now, most of our culture thinks it's their environment or it's a sickness. So they try to change the environment to change the child. But that won't do you any good. Nor will, take for example ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. Have you heard of this before? It's an official clinical disease in the manual of psychiatry. I can't remember what it's called. ODD. And WebMD lists some of the symptoms this way: temper tantrums, arguing with adults, refusing to abide by the rules, blaming others for their mistakes, outbursts of anger, etc., etc. Now, what does WebMD claim is the cause? It's biology, genetics, or the environment. But sin is not even on the horizon. See, so we're going to get that kind of constant, and so they're going to medicate this kid. If it's a disease, they're going to give him drugs to numb the child, to pacify him, and help him conquer these symptoms. But it's not a disease. The problem is indwelling sin. And we need, as parents, need to be just crystal clear on this so that we apply the appropriate remedy against discipline and affection. As one faithful parent always reminds me, the heart of the problem is a problem heart. Would you say that with me? The heart of the problem is a problem heart. They act badly because they are bad. Our children are radically disordered at the deepest and most basic level. Our oldest daughter, Sarah, got a degree in what was it, Judy? Early child development, yeah. And then she became a school teacher, second grade teacher. But I remember at Washington State University, I was invited, so several of the parents of the students in her discipline were invited to come down and speak to the class about different parenting styles. And I did. And I said what I'm saying here. And the teacher, I thought she's going to crucify me. Because she believes that, and this is the standard training, that kids are basically good. Kids come out of the womb, they're basically good. And it's their environment that corrupts them. Bad parents, etc., bad school friends at school, maybe poverty, etc., are the problem. So I said, no, that's not the problem at all. I quoted James Dobson and some other problems. Well, they were horrified. By the way, she has no children. She was a single woman, which explains a lot too, doesn't it? But at the academic level, that's what you're going to find virtually everywhere. There's a Frenchman named Piaget, P-I-A-G-E-T, who's a rating specialist in this area, and his standard teaching is your children are basically good. It's the environment that corrupts them. That comes out of the Enlightenment. And you've got to be really clear about that, and you have to know that that idea is going around, so when you hear it, you can say, that's not the issue. Here's what the Bible says, Jeremiah 17. The heart is deceitful above all things. It is desperately sick. Who can understand it? Romans chapter 3, verse 10 and 11. None is righteous, no, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. In Ephesians chapter 2, which I've already quoted, they are by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. The problem is at the heart level. The problem is sin. Our children are bad because the heart is bad. That's going to show up it's going to have different manifestations in each child. One child may be really compliant because they want to please their parents, so they fear man is the sin. But it's an easy child to raise because there's not much discipline that has to take place. Another child may be just mega rebellious and requires 10 spankings a day because they're just a rebel. Nobody's going to tell them what to do. They don't want to please their parents. They could care less about pleasing their parents. And we have the same problem, sin expressing itself a different way. The problem is the heart. What the world excuses, the Bible simply labels works of the flesh. Galatians chapter 5. Now the works of the flesh are evident. Remember what I just read about ODD. Here's what the Bible says about ODD. Now the works of the flesh are evident. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife. How many of your kids fight and bicker all the time and it's driving you crazy? Where does that come from? It comes from the flesh. Fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. The flesh, it comes out of the heart, it comes out of the fallen human nature. The short-term solution is the discipline and instruction of the Lord mentioned in Ephesians 6. And the long-term solution is more radical. It's a heart transplant that occurs at new birth. So, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, Proverbs tells us. But the rod of discipline drives that folly far from him. Proverbs 22, verse 15. Our children are not basically good, and the proof that the heart of the problem is a problem heart should be obvious to any observant parent or any observant person, even non-Christians. Why? For example, you don't need to teach your children to be bad. If they were basically good, you'd have to teach them to lie, to swear, to steal, to bite their brothers and sisters, to fight constantly, to bicker, to be possessive, idolatrous, etc., etc. But you don't have to teach them to do that. That's natural. You have to teach them to be good. It's pretty amazing, isn't it, that we could ever come up with these crazy theories that are so rooted in human pride about basic human nature. The first word most kids learn is no or mine, right? You're laughing because those are the first words our kids learn. Mine! And no! Sarah, come over to me. She turns and looks at me and just goes the other way, you know. Why is that? Because it's a heart problem. The gospel also gives us a window on how God feels about sin. God hates it. It provokes his wrath. At the cross, we see how God feels about our children's complaining, about their rebellion, about their temper tantrums, about selfishness, about lack of self-control. The cross says God hates these hard attitudes. They deserve crucifixion. This is, of course, a very unpopular idea today. Yet if it's true, how can we be passive about our children's heart sins and claim to love them? We can't. We can't be passive. We have to be pretty aggressive. For this reason, those clear on the gospel practice corporal punishment, corporal discipline, appropriate spanking at an appropriate age with small children. The world says corporal punishment is child abuse, but the Bible responds, failure to discipline our children is child abuse. And we all have to make a decision which side of that equation we're going to fall on. We just did a parenting conference in Portland, Oregon a couple weeks ago. Portland is a very liberal place. If you've ever been there, it's probably the most liberal city in the United States. It's a wacky place. There's some good churches there, thank goodness. When we did this parenting conference, we just got all kinds of really interesting responses in the Q&A from people, especially about spanking. Christians, evangelical Christians that have been affected and influenced and formed by our greater culture, which sees any kind of form of spanking as child abuse. So there's the first thing we need. If we're going to be good disciplinarians, we have to be really clear on indwelling sin. Secondly, we need to be clear and comfortable with the idea of being authority figures. Christian parents must not only understand sin, they must have a deep conviction about the goodness and appropriateness of authority. Effective parents see authority with biblical eyes. God loves authority, and God hates rebellion. Now, there's a good example in the Old Testament. It's in 2 Kings, chapter 2. And Elisha, the prophet, is passing by. Here's what the text reads. Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you bald head! Go up, you bald head!" He must have been bald. And they're making fun of him. They're mocking him. And Elisha turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. These are children. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. Now, what's happening there? Elisha is God's authority. All authority is from God. Elisha is God's delegated authority. And when these boys mock Elisha, they mock God. And Elisha knew that. And so he called a curse down upon these children, and they paid the price. Now, that doesn't happen regularly. Thank goodness it doesn't. But that gives us a window into how God feels about mocking authority or rebelling against authority. That includes your authority as a parent. Did you know in the Old Testament that if a child struck its parents, it was a capital crime? Death by stoning. If a child cursed its parents, it was a capital crime. Death by stoning. Now, should we do that today? No. But that gives us, God doesn't want us to do that today, but that gives us a window into how God feels. How sacred the authority of a parent is. The 5th commandment, honor your father and your mothers, that it may go well with you. Because when you honor your father and mother, you're honoring God. If you don't honor your father and mother, you're dishonoring God. If your children dishonor you and you don't deal with it, then God's going to have to deal with it. And you don't want that to happen. Okay, so when your children mock you, make fun of you, talk back to you, and you allow that to happen, what you're doing is you're inviting God to bring down a curse on your children. That's how God feels. That's how strongly God feels about that. Romans 13. All authority is from God. You're an authority figure. Your authority comes from God. You represent God to your children. And so how your children treat you is how they treat God. So if you allow that to happen, you're inviting disaster in your children's lives. I don't know how to make it any more clear or more plain. You're teaching your children to obey God when they obey you. You're training your children to obey you and respect your authority so that when they grow up, they can respect God's authority and obey Him. So biblical parents don't just exercise authority, they exercise servant authority because God's authority is always servant authority. Parents are shepherds of the smallest biblical flock. Therefore, Paul's charge to Timothy applies to parents as well. And listen to this. 2 Timothy chapter 4. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Rebuke and exhort with complete patience and teaching. That's a good description of a parent's calling in life. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. Patience. It takes a lot of patience, doesn't it? I mean, you know, I remember one of the women of my congregation came to me 10 years ago, and she said, her 6-year-old son, she said, I can't think of his name, thank goodness. But she said, my son's, he's very strong-willed, oldest son, and she said, he's driving me crazy. I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm afraid I'm going to hurt him, because I find myself getting really angry with him. Because I spank him for an issue, and 5 minutes later he does it again, and I spank him again. 30 minutes later he does it again, and I spank him again. She said, I'm wearing out. I don't know what to do. And I'm afraid I'm going to lose it one of these days and hurt him. I'm going to be so angry with him. Have any of you felt that way with your kids? Yeah. And so I said, her name is JJ, I said, JJ, persevere. This will change. Logan is the boy's name. Logan will change. You're going to conquer his will if you just persevere. I know it's hard right now, but keep going. Well, in about 2 years, at age 8, it was over. And she persevered, and he quit needing all that discipline. He still needed some, but he's 17 now. He's a model student. He's a model child. He plays on a local high school football team. He's just a kid that any parent would be super proud to be parenting. But it was tough. It was really hard in the early years. Now, some of you have children like that. In every group this size, there's always parents that have a really strong-willed child that is driving you to the end of yourself. One of the guys in our church had a child, a female, young girl. This is 10 years ago too. She was 5. And, you know, she just would never, she would not, no matter what her father did in there, discipline, he was a good father. And in teaching and explaining, she would bow her back and she would not yield. It was a really tough situation. And I remember him telling me once that I'm not proposing you do this, but he just got desperate. He said, I put her in the shower. The only thing that would break her, I put her in the shower and turn cold water on. And then she would finally say, okay, Dad. She would give up. Some kids are like that. I'm just saying that to you, to encourage you. Some of you, I'll bet, have a child like that. And don't give up. Your job is to convince that child you're going to conquer the child's will. No matter what it takes, you're going to win the war. If it takes 10 years, okay, 10 years, you're going to persevere in this. Because that's what it means to love that child. Because if you don't conquer that child's will, that stubborn, rebellious will is going to cause that child trouble all their life. My son, who just took over from me in the lead pastor role in our church, he's now 41, that's what he was like when he was little. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this kid? I remember one day I spanked him 7 times one day. And he would go and turn my electric razor on in the bathroom. And I said, no, Dave, you can't do that. I spanked him 15 minutes. And it hurt. I spanked him hard. 15 minutes later, he's back doing the same thing. I thought, I can't believe he's doing this, because that really hurt. So I spanked him again. Half hour later, he's back doing it again. Now, I could have put the razor up where he couldn't get it, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to teach him. It was a training, and it was a Sunday, I remember. And I remember at the end of the day thinking, oh my goodness, how can any child have such a strong will? I wouldn't have done that as a kid. One spanking and I'm done with it, you know. I don't like pain. But he wasn't like that. Well, I remember God impressing me, or Judy, one of us, I remember at that young stage, that if I could get this kid, if I could conquer this kid's will, that strength of will could be used someday for the glory of God and for the kingdom of God. And that's what's happening now. He's a great leader in the church. He's doing a great job. He's really proud of him as a leader. Where does that leadership come from? It comes from that strength of will. And so just to encourage you, if you've got a child like that, as you persevere, that child might be your most productive child as an adult. Might be the child that is most used by God. Most of the time, children like that will pass through the teen years. A child like that is oftentimes in their teen years, they are not as affected by peer pressure as other children are because of that strength of will. They're able to say no. They're able to say, I'm not going to do it, you're not going to do it my way. You know, I'm going to do it God's way. And it's because of that strength of will. So, where do we gain God's perspective on authority? Well, again, we obtain it from the gospel. Jesus' suffering on the cross is the measure of God's hatred for rebellion against authority. Because ultimately, the number one issue in life is the issue of authority. We all, on the day of final judgment, are going to have to stand before God and make an accounting whether we came under His authority and obeyed His commands and sought to serve Him and please Him, or whether we didn't. And so Jesus has died on the cross atoning for all of our rebellion against authority so that God the Father can receive us on the day of final judgment and bring us into eternal paradise. And through the cross we see how strongly God feels about authority. One time I witnessed this exchange. Mom asked her grade school-age daughter to set the table. "Why should I set the table?" the daughter answered resentfully. "I'm tired of doing your work. Set the table yourself. None of my friends have to set the table. Why should I be different?" Now, how would a loving parent respond to that? See? That speech wasn't to the mom. That speech was, God sees that speech as being spoken to God himself. He or she would discipline the child. Why? Because the eternal and temporal consequences for this rebellion are deeply disturbing. Now, if the child's a teenager, I'm not saying you spank a child at that age, but maybe if it's a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old, you might. But you're going to find some appropriate form of discipline for a child like that. You're going to sit down and talk to them. You're going to explain to them what I'm saying today. Listen, do you realize how serious that is? You can talk about the death penalty in the Old Testament for that kind of speech or whatever, but you want to impress your kids with how serious this is. So there's first two things. We are clear about indwelling sin. Second, we're comfortable being authority figures. And thirdly, effective disciplinarians use corporal punishment to communicate the gospel to their children. Discipline, as much as possible, should be an event. By that I mean, we're not just lashing out at our children at the dinner table or something with a spanking stick or whatever we're using in a heat of anger. We take our child aside, we calm down, we take them into a bathroom or a bedroom or something in a private place, and we make discipline into an event with our children. This takes a lot of discipline, because usually when our children act up, we're right in the middle of something else, and we don't want to stop to do this. But if you do this, it really bears fruit. And you're trying to accomplish a couple things. You're trying to help the child see that there's a connection between rebellion and pain. That sin and pain always go together, number one. Number two, you're trying to convince the child that God's love and God's discipline always go together. God disciplines the sons that he loves. And so I'm disciplining you because I love you. And thirdly, you want to make it an opportunity to preach the gospel to your child. So it might go something like this. Now, this is not in the Bible, so you can take this or reject it. It's an idea. Put your child on your knee. You talk about how the child mouthed off at the dinner table, like the story I just read about. And you say, now, this is a serious thing that you did. Did you know in the Old Testament that God commanded children that spoke the way you spoke to be put to death? That's how serious God sees this sin. But because Jesus died on the cross in your place, you're not going to die. Jesus took the death penalty in your place. But because I love you, because God loves you, God commands me to discipline you, to impress upon you the seriousness of this. So you bend the child over, you give him a swat, however you're going to do that. Maybe if you're a woman and you don't hit very hard, you hit him 2 or 3 times. I asked my grandsons the other day who they'd rather be disciplined by, their mom or their dad. And they all said, my dad. My mom, I mean. Don't want my dad to spank me. Why? Dad spanks once and it really hurts. Mom has to spank 2 or 3 times and it doesn't hurt very bad at all. Okay, that's kind of generally the world we live in. So whatever's appropriate, but you got to make it hurt. It doesn't bear any fruit. Then you wait till the child quits crying. You hug them. Now you're communicating love and affection to the child. You have the child confess the sin. You need to ask your mother's or your father's forgiveness for the way you spoke when I asked you to set the table. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Mom. Please forgive me. So I think it's also really important to get them to confess a particular sin, which you'll find them very reluctant to do. Okay, what are you sorry for? For the way I spoke to you with disrespect at the dinner table. Did you know that when you speak to me disrespectfully like that, you're speaking to God that way? And that's why because I'm God's delegated authority in your life. And that's why I'm disciplining you. So then you forgive them. If they've bit one of the brothers and sisters, you go out and you perform restitution with the brother or sister. And what happens? The child leaves the room, their conscience is cleansed, the guilt is removed. They usually skip out of the room, fairly happy. And you've done several things. You've preached the gospel to them. You've reminded them of penal substitution, what their sin deserves, the mercy and grace and love of God that was poured out in their place. You've communicated, you've coupled 2 things, discipline and love, together in the child's thinking. And you've also connected sin and pain together with the child. So spanking does all those things. Now there's other forms of discipline you could use, but they don't accomplish those ends. For example, time out. Okay, go to your bedroom for an hour. But when you do that, and when they're teens, that kind of discipline is more effective. But when you do that, what happens? You're not coupling the discipline with the gospel. You're not coupling discipline with affection. You're not healing the guilt and getting it expunged. And you're not going through restitution or reconciliation between you and the child. None of those things are happening. The child might go to the room and just work up a deep pit of resentment towards you for putting them in their bedroom for an hour, and nothing is accomplished. Does that make sense? So the world's going to recommend all kinds of other ways to discipline children, but none of them accomplish the ends we want to accomplish with discipline. Besides that, the Bible is quite clear. It commands us to use the rod and to discipline our children. Effective parents use corporal punishment to discipline their children. I don't have all the text written out here. I should have done that. From Proverbs about spanking, but they're pretty strong. Most of you are familiar with those texts, I'm sure. And many people are trying to say today that when it talks about using a rod on your children, the rod is, no, it doesn't really mean a rod. It means other forms of discipline, because we know that using a rod is child abuse. Again, I would suggest to you that failing to use the rod when your children are young is child abuse. Okay, so I said when we started, we need two things. We need discipline and we need affection. Now the part of this I like to talk about the most is the affection part of it. And that's part 2 here. So, I keep forgetting to switch my slides. Gospel discipline, and number 2, gospel affection. Gospel affection starts when you love your child more, you love God more than you love your child. So God wants us to love our children because God loves them. And when we couple discipline and love together with our children, it's a potent combination. That coupling of those two things working together tends to drive the discipline into our children's hearts. Many studies have been done by social scientists showing that this is the case. When there's lots of affection and lots of discipline, it tends to help internalize the lessons we're trying to teach our children at the heart level. So there was a story that I heard several years ago that I never forgot. It was about communist China in the 1955-ish. It's a Christian woman in China, and by this point in time, after World War II, China's being completely overrun by Mao, and they're trying to suppress all religion. This woman was a widow, and she had a small child about age 1 or 2 that she was trying to raise. The state came to her and they said, unless you renounce Christianity, we're going to take your child away from you. She said, I can't renounce Christianity. So the state took her child away. She didn't see him again until he was 20. He was raised in state schools. And when she was coupled again with her child, he'd been completely indoctrinated by the state. He was an atheist. He was a hardened communist. He had no respect for his mother. And it broke her heart. Now that's a heavy price to pay, isn't it, for following Christ? But we have to have in our own mind, we have to be made up in our own minds that our love for God supersedes our love for our children. And when we think about showing our children affection, that's where it's got to start. We have to start with the idea that I love God more than I love my children, and I need to communicate that to my children so that they know that, so that I will have their respect. Second thing we do when we show affection is that we love our children sacrificially. Here we all think of this right away as an important way to love. For example, parents save up money in savings accounts for their children for college. Maybe as you get older and you're getting ready to retire or die, you want to leave an inheritance to your children. In other words, we want to live sacrificially for our children. Maybe your kids are young and you don't have much money and they're on the soccer team, and it's going to cost you a couple $100 to fit your kid on the soccer team, but you do it because you love your children. You're loving sacrificially. I remember hearing a story about James Dobson, and this is another story that deeply impressed me. He was the only child. His father was a traveling evangelist. Have any of you heard this story before? Anybody? A couple of you have. Father was a traveling evangelist, and he had traveling, he was booked out 2 years for events where he was going to be doing evangelism at other churches in other areas. James was about 16. He was a really strong-willed child. His mother was having a hard time controlling him. So his mother called the father, who was out of town at the time, and said, I can't remember the dad's name, I think it was James too. I don't know what to do, I can't control our son. So the dad, this is a sacrifice, the dad canceled all those speaking engagements out for 2 years and came home to be with his son when he was in high school, until he finished high school and went off to college. And then the dad tried to he became an associate pastor at a church in the local area. And then when James went away to college and the dad tried to get his evangelism career going again, he couldn't because he'd lost all the momentum. What a price to pay. But that's what it means to love sacrificially. And the dad paid a big price for that, but look at how the church has benefited with Focus on the Family and all the things that came out of that. So sometimes, as a parent, it's going to mean big sacrifices for you. Maybe you're a working mom, and God is speaking to you about the fact that your children need you at home. You're thinking, yeah, but I love my career. And besides that, what are people going to think about me if I just stay home and parent? I don't continue with my career. They'll think I've given into patriarchal power structures or something. And I'm not today's modern woman. But if there's real love for your children, and that's the best thing for your children, it may be the right thing for you to do could be for you to stay home with your kids, if you can do that. Those are examples of how affection shows itself in the area of sacrifice, or love shows itself in the area of sacrifice. And lastly, we express a love for our children through affection. God the Father sent his Son to die on the cross so that God the Father could have an affectionate relationship with us. God the Father wanted to feel affection for us. God the Father wanted to have an intimate relationship with us, but he couldn't with our unatoned for sin. So he sent his Son to die on the cross so that he could enter into a relationship with those that would believe the gospel and turn from their sins and be a figure of affection in our lives. God the Father is the fountain of all affection, and his affection, the ability to be affectionate with us, was very costly to him. So we love our children affectionately, and we get that passion for affection from the cross of Christ. Affection is very powerful with our children. It makes the parent and the parent's God attractive to our children. It communicates love and acceptance to our children. We might tell our children that we love them, but when we are affectionate, we convince them, our children, that we love them. Affection is like a hammer that drives the nail of truth deep into our children's heart. So we have lots of discipline, but we also have lots of affection. That discipline will take root in our children's heart because our children feel that we really love them. It would be hard to overstate the importance of affection. In his best-selling book, How to Really Love Your Child, Ross Campbell writes, discipline is immeasurably easier when the child feels genuinely loved. If a child does not feel genuinely loved and accepted, he has real difficulty identifying with his parents and their values. So affection is like a bridge between you here and your discipline, over which your discipline travels, between you and your child's heart. The discipline is traveling over that bridge of affection, and your teaching and your discipline, and that it's making a connection between you and your child's heart. Affection is really important. Affection is especially powerful when it comes from fathers. A mountain of social research highlights the crucial role of father's affection. It impacts the child's heart in a way that mom's affection just does not, especially as the children get older. Now, it's not to say that mom's affection isn't really important, it is. But the father's affection is uniquely powerful. In his book, In Search of a Father, James Robson, the evangelist, uses the term nurturance instead of affectionate. This is what he says. I read this book years ago when our kids were in grade school, had a huge impact on them. Quote, nurturance, or affection, is one of the key ingredients in the socialization of the child. Without affection, a child may seem to assimilate the values taught by parents, especially the father, without actually adopting those values. Proper nurturance or affection prepares the child mentally and emotionally to accept moral tenets and correct patterns for relationships with other people. You see what he's saying about affection? And he cited a whole bunch of social studies that bore this out. In other words, the more affectionate a father and a mother are, especially the father, the more likely that your children will internalize the lessons you're trying to teach them. By contrast, children tend to reject the values of unaffectionate fathers. David Popenoe, not a Christian, but a specialist on fatherhood, a sociologist, writes, quote, when I read this, I was shocked at this information. Fathers who spent time with their children more than twice a week, giving meals, baths, and other basic care, reared the most compassionate adults. This single factor accounted for a greater percentage of the adult outcome of empathy than the three strongest maternal predictors combined. Now what Popenoe is saying is this: when fathers are affectionate with their children tend to grow up and become very empathetic. And he's saying that basically that has 3 times the potency to produce that effect as a mother's affection does. Guys, very important that we're affectionate with our children. Sometimes it's very hard to be affectionate with your child because you don't like a particular child. If you have more than one child, you're going to have some children that you really relate to easily and you like, and other children that are really hard for you to be around. It's just the way it is. But you can't show favoritism. And you've got to especially work at showing affection to that child who was hard for you. Why? Because that's what God did with you, didn't he? Jesus came down and died for you. As I said earlier, you were obnoxious in God's sight. His wrath rested upon you. You were his enemy, and he loved you with everlasting love. So the test of that comes when we have a child that's hard for us to love. It's hard for us to be around. Did any of you have a child like that? Yeah, I don't think you're all liars. I did see all the hands go up. Okay? When your children get to be adults, there'll be some that are easier to be around than others. Some you like better than others. And but you can't show favoritism. That affection has to go out without prejudice towards your children. And when you do that, you're most godlike. You're acting most like God when you love the child that's hardest to love. In other words, the presence of a nurturing, affectionate father is the most important predictor of a child's capacity for compassion and emotional warmth as an adult. This is important because we assume the opposite, that mom's affection is determinative. The father's affection, or its lack, also uniquely impacts his child's long-term happiness. Young adults, Popenoe again writing, young adults who feel emotionally close to their fathers tend to be happier and more satisfied in life regardless of their feelings towards their mothers. Henry Biller, the noted psychologist, observed, boys who are able to confide in their fathers were likely to have high self-esteem. The early father-child relationship is particularly important for the child's self-esteem. Among adolescents, those who were father-absent had lower self-esteem than those who had fathers in the home, especially when father absence had begun in early childhood. Did you know that you can correlate almost all male homosexuality back to the homosexual male's relationship with his father? In exactly 70% of the cases of male homosexuality, the father is distant and unaffectionate. He may be cruel and tyrannical, distant and unaffectionate with his children, and the mother is very controlling. She's trying to compensate for the father's lack of affection. Every male homosexual I know fits that pattern. But social studies have confirmed that that's also the pattern. In other words, there's a direct relationship between how a father relates to his children in terms of his affection with them and their ability to internalize a normal heterosexual sexuality. Now it's interesting that on the female side, that pattern does not bear out the same way, but with male homosexuality it does. Okay, let's close with 3 quick ways to show affection. So if affection is this important, what can we do to be affectionate? 3 things we can do: focused attention, eye contact, and physical touch. And I want to mention a 4th one too, which is identifying evidences of grace. When our children were young, it's not easy for me to listen to my kids. It's hard for me to give focused attention, look my children in the eye and carry on a conversation with them. And any of you other dads find that a problem as well? So I thought, I know this is really important. I've got to find a way to do this. What am I going to do? So Judy and I talked about it, and I started doing, we just called it special times at home. I would take one of the children out each week, and I would do something that they wanted to do, like go to McDonald's, get an ice cream cone, or go to Perkins Pancakes. They used to make these pancakes in the form of a face with 2 little cherries for eyes and whipping cream for a mouth and nose, kids love that. I'd take them to Perkins for breakfast or something and buy them whatever they wanted. But the important, and then I would just sit and listen to them. I'd draw them out and talk to them. That's what I had to do to give my children focused attention. But when we give our children focused attention and make eye contact with them and listen to them, what we're doing is we're saying, you're important to me. You matter to me. I love you. I value you. And I want to say again, this is especially important for fathers. Also important for moms. So those are the first 2 things, focused attention, eye contact. So if you're not good at this, sit down and think, what's something that I can do, what's an environment I can put myself in with my child where it'll help me establish contact or focused attention with my child. Second thing you can do is physical touch. Physical touch is very, very important. Now we're a little anxious about physical touch today because there's so much sex abuse with children. But I would just say to you that it's normal for a father to have lots of physical affection with his sons and daughters. By that I mean, if they're working on their computer, come up behind them and put your hand on their back. Just a touch. Have lots of hugs in your home. When your teenage daughters come home, have them come sit in your lap. We were doing a conference like this in Roseburg, Oregon a couple of years ago, and we were staying in the home of the pastor for whom we were doing a conference, and he had a 15-year-old daughter. And we're all sitting in the front room talking, and his daughter came in from school, ran in and jumped into her dad's lap and sat in his lap. And I thought, oh man, that is perfect. That's exactly what we want to have happening. We want she's 20 now, I think. I just talked to him, the dad, the other day. I said, how's your daughter doing? No, she's in college now. It's college. But at any rate, but the important thing was this father had established that kind of a relationship with his kids. Lots of touch, good, wholesome physical touch and affection, hugging, kids sitting in their dad's lap, wrestling with their kids on the floor as huge dads. Because again, there's lots of physical touch and there's lots of affection and you're having fun together. And there's a last thing you can do to communicate affection to your children, and that is identify evidences of grace in your children's life. Now this is hard to do, especially when a child is misbehaving. For many men, affection is not natural. The hard competitive realities of life have frozen their emotions. Other fathers express affection awkwardly. The ease with which our wives show affection sometimes mystifies us. Some feel inadequate by comparison. Some men feel this way because they have not been around men that are affectionate. Your own father wasn't affectionate. And so it feels unnatural to you. I just encourage you to overcome that. The first way to show affection is with focused attention. The second way is appropriate touch. And the third way is to demonstrate affection with verbal encouragement. C.J. Mahaney of Sovereign Grace Ministries calls it pointing out evidences of grace in our children. And although there are times when you must criticize, the emphasis in your speech should be identifying things that your kids do well. This is especially important when you have a child who you're really distressed with. I mean, this child's been a pain for the last 3 months. Maybe they're going through puberty or something, or they're just in an owie mood, and everything you ask them to do, they do the opposite. And your relationship is one of just constant conflict, discipline, et cetera, et cetera. This happens in every home. There are times when it's like this. When that's going on, it's very important for you, crucially important for you, to look at that child and say, there must be something good going on in that child's life. Can I see anything good there? Now, I'm telling you, sometimes that's a challenge. Sometimes you can't see anything good. And that's because of your own pride, okay, usually. So, what is my child doing good? There must be something I can encourage this child on. I need to identify some evidence of grace at work in this child's heart and life. And I can just tell you from personal experience, sometimes this is very difficult to do. So maybe, the child comes in from school in the afternoon, and instead of being surly and nasty, he says something nice to one of his brothers or sisters. You see it. You say, I noticed what you said when you came in from school today. I really appreciated the way you spoke so warmly to your sister. You haven't often done that, and I just want you to know that's an evidence of God's grace at work in your life. And what are you doing? You're showing this child that you're not always mad at them, even though you are, but you're trying to show them you're not. You're trying to pretend like you're not. You're also recognizing that it's not all bad. that God's working in the child's life. And third, you're communicating to that child some level of affection. Those words are saying to that child, you're not a glass half empty. You're a glass half full. And I want to communicate that to you. I love you. I'm proud of you. And that's what those words say to the child. Again, this will be a big challenge. If a child's easy to be around, if a child's always obedient, if it's a compliant child, then that will be very easy for you to do. There'll be evidences of grace everywhere. And you need to identify those in that child's life as well. But when it really goes south in the relationship, that's when you've got to especially work at finding evidences of grace. God, please help me find evidence of grace in this child's life. There's got to be something somewhere, Lord. Help me. Please, God, help me see something good. Sometimes that's the way you feel. Has anybody ever felt that way with a child? Yeah. So if you have many children, you're going to be that at the point at least once, probably multiple times. One reason is the reason this is so hard is because we think about their faults and little about their virtues. This is especially true for difficult children. But the difficult child is usually the one that most needs this from us. A friend asked a mother for the first thing she thought of when a particular child came to mind. She told me later that only negative words came to mind, and it disturbed her. We all get that way sometimes. The second reason we struggle to identify grace in our children is that we take God's grace for granted. We have not learned to be thankful for our children. And despite their problems, we think we deserve better as parents. We are ungrateful, and a lack of gratitude always points to pride in our lives because we don't deserve to have any children. And the fact that we have children is a wonderful expression of God's grace to us. Yeah, our children have problems. They have problems, and God is working through those problems to deal with us, to change us, to sanctify us. And so we should be thankful. God, thank you for my children's problems. Lord, thank you for the way my children relate to me or don't relate to me. Lord, I'm so thankful for how you're using this in my life. And when we begin to take that attitude upon ourselves, we're humbling ourselves. We're admitting that it's pretty rough right now, but I'm still getting better than I deserve. And secondly, that's going to spill over in our child's life. When we begin to have that attitude towards the child, we